Right. Now, I'm really glad that I chose to do life cycle modelling at this time of day, just before the bar opens. So thank you, everyone, for staying with me. It's a couple of friendly faces in there, but I do appreciate everyone's attention. I know I stand between you and the evening entertainment, but hopefully I won't take too much of your time. Okay, so... so the life cycle modelling, well, this used to stand between highway authorities and money off the incentive fund. Obviously, the incentive fund has been put on the back burner for a little while, but it'll come out again. The point about it, though, is it isn't actually really important. And I'm not going to talk about just a kind of sausage machine, really, where you think something in and you hope something comes out. I'm going to talk about the thoughtful process that goes into looking at, principally, I'm talking carriageways here, but it applies to any highway asset. Okay, so what is it and why do we use it? Well, I'd put some definitions in before I go on to why. Partly because, there's a lot of jargon that goes around our industry. There's a lot of jargon that goes around asset management. But simplistically put, it is about looking after what you've got. So I won't go through it all really, but the life cycle strategy sets out how you want to manage your asset. And actually, life cycle modelling, that's an active verb, really. It's about doing something. It's not just about the model itself. It's not just about software. It's not just about deterioration curves. It's about that active process of feeding in information and data in order to understand how you're best going to manage your highway. So it differs from scheme identification, obviously. It's a much longer term view of your highway asset. So it could be for 20 years plus, it could be up to 60 years. It doesn't ignore scheme identification, though. An important part of life cycle modelling is how do you actually maintain highways? So it's not just about if it's broken, you immediately fix it. It's about how do you fix it and what different methods do you use to fix it. And I think that's a really important point. If you take away nothing else, think about that. We don't automatically jump on every single poor bit of the network and change that to good and then jump on the next bit that's falling into poor. The way we maintain highways is much more complex, and it is obviously a very complex asset. So, as I say, don't ignore scheme identification when we're looking at life cycle modelling, because what you do now feeds into how your asset will turn out 20 years later. But why have a strategy? Why do this modelling? Why put yourselves through it? Why stand here before you could be queuing up for the bar? It's because it's a really useful planning and budgeting tool. In a sense, in order to know what to do now, you also have to look forwards. So it can help you make strategic decisions. So maintenance is always about risks and opportunities and how you trade off those risks and balances against each other. So you can take a longer term view of what happens if I do this compared to this. You can look about your current decisions. So is the way that I'm doing maintenance going to keep up with the need? Is it going to fall far short of that? Could I do things differently? What impact does it have if I do things differently? What am I doing now that will impact in the future? And then understand the changing requirements. So obviously a really big one is how we achieve much lower carbon, hopefully zero carbon with certain things. But also things like changing demographics. We've got an aging population, but there are some cities that buck that trend and have a younger population. What does that mean to the way you need to maintain your highway, whether that's footways or carriageways? What does it mean about how people are going to be accessing and using your carriageways? Are you going to have a lot more e-scooters or a lot more mobility scooters? So these are the types of things that we can incorporate into life cycle modelling that are particular to your locality. And this is all about the data that goes in to make the model actually really thoughtful, but also really relevant to what your locality is all about.
Really fun.
And then finally, benefits of the work that you're doing. Highway is not necessarily, it's very noticeable, isn't it? Because every year there's pothole day, and every time you look at the local paper, there's something about how rubbish the council is. If it's not about grass verges, it's about potholes. But actually, hardly anyone ever says, well, how do you know you're doing a good job? And a lot of this is actually about showing that with the money that you've got, with the tools that you've got, with the ability to work on the highway, you could well be doing a magnificent job. And a lot of that shows the evidence of what you're doing over the longer term. Even if you haven't got a lot of money, it shows that you're thinking about how you best use it. Okay, so what goes into life cycle modelling? I've talked about this being a very active process. The good news is that you don't have to do all the really difficult stuff necessarily, but you do certainly have to want to engage in the process if you're a local highway authority. So as you can see, I've set it up as a sort of iterative process really, because you can go back round and improve things with more data over the years. But effectively, the first thing is, well, what do you want to know? What are your objectives? What are the national objectives? Is that government? What are the council objectives? Do they want you to focus on sort of building economic factors around your borough? Do they want you to look at society? What sort of things are in your council high-level priorities? But also, what sort of things are in your highway plans? What do you want to achieve? What are you doing at the moment? Obviously, asset data is really useful. I'll talk a little bit about condition data slightly further on. But anything that you've got really that can feed in to how your roads have performed over the past in order that we can understand what they're going to do into the future. And any asset data that you have that's really useful. And don't forget, I use the word roads, but it could mean carriageways, could mean footways, could mean other types of assets. The middle bit is where the model comes in. So that's the data science part of it. That's the bit where we get lots of clever algorithms working. We get lots of deep learning. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So a lot of the heavy lifting is done in the background. But at the end of it all, that's translated back into outputs. And those outputs are showing you some of the ways that things will happen, given the uncertainties, given the probabilities over the next 10, 20, 40 years. But of course, there's also, those are just outputs in themselves. They're giving you lots of really useful intelligence, but ultimately there is still a decision-making process. And that's the other active part of it really, is it gives you that information at your fingertips and it lays it out in ways that are very meaningful so that you can decide, well, what can I do? What do I want to do? Where are my limitations in achieving some of this? And make those strategic decisions about how you want to go forward. This is the Gaist Lifecycle model. So as you can see, there's a lot of, it's very data-led in that there's a lot of data that goes in there. Not all of it belongs, if you like, to the local highway authority. Not all of it is necessary to come from the local highway authority. Some of that is about inflation, for example. Some of that is about how you might allocate things or how other treatments might work, treatments you don't even necessarily use. And at the top, obviously, what sort of type of data you might have, all of that is useful. But then the bit on this side, those historical data samples, that's a very important part of the model itself. And that's about how do roads deteriorate. So you could have all the great data in the world, but unless we can put that through something that will shape how those particular roads are going to deteriorate, that starting point ends up not really being very useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that deterioration model. I've no idea if I've run over time, actually, but stay with me. I don't think I have yet. So it's a critical element. Now, it's a very critical element in local roads, which are made up, as I said, of some very complex geometry, very complex materials at times, or actually not complex materials at all. So obviously the ideal on that side for a flexible road structure is how you might build it up in terms of doing the proper sort of material types, the compaction, the capping. And actually what we've got just down the road from me is a local bus route which is built on chalk and flint and actually regularly pops open with potholes because it is on chalk and flint. So that's all very well, but is our deterioration model based on the scientific curve and the sort of code of practice, reinstatement of highways, or is it actually built on what happens with local roads and what happens with different types of local roads? So the answer is for our deterioration model, what we've done is we've looked at not just a wide sample of data, but a huge sample of data over time. And because we've got massive image banks as well, the way we collect our data is through imagery. We've got an awful lot of imagery to look back over and double check maintenance records, for example, against what was actually going on and what's going on now. And so what that does is it gives a really, really good insight into local road deterioration. So if this is a bituminous A road, how generally does that deteriorate over all these samples? Now, that's where a lot of the computer work comes in, and a lot of the deep learning. Computers still work predominantly in binary fashion. So we translate all of that into ways that a computer effectively can do an awful lot of clever crunching of all those samples and churn out effectively a model that starts to represent more and more how local roads deteriorate. And of course, the more samples that we have, the more we feed it into the model, the more the model improves. And so what we're doing effectively is helping the machine to learn and then to model for itself how roads are likely to deteriorate. So what's the probably saying? Feed in hundreds of thousands of possibilities, and you look at the probability of what turns up. And so we're combining some quite clever computer science modelling with obviously our knowledge of local roads. And so what's the chance that it will deteriorate in that way from a grade 1? And you can see there's lots of probabilities, lots of different stages of a road's life cycle, and lots of different options, if you like, for that section of road to go in different ways. But of course, what we're doing with the modelling is we're narrowing down the uncertainty. Don't let anyone ever tell you that a model can actually guarantee you absolute 100% certainty, because the whole point about predicting into the future is we use the best things that we can at the time. So there will always be an element of uncertainty. What we're trying to do in our modelling, and others will be doing in theirs, is trying to reduce that element of uncertainty. So when you're making your decisions, it's not so much guesswork, it's a lot more intelligence behind that. So come on to forecasting, which again is the important part of it. Now, I mentioned earlier about scheme identification being really important, and what I've done here is show you localised condition, as shown by Gaist. Bit of a plug for us there. But actually, you can see there's lots of different colours in there, red being the poor and blue being the good. Now, if you had a life cycle model that only took the poor condition and said, okay, well, we'll mend that, you'll end up with an awful lot of patching programs, which you may well do, but that's not the only type of maintenance you do. If you look at those examples, you can see where the thicker line is, sorry, I keep shouting into my thing, don't I? Is actually the type of scheme that you might do for maintenance. And obviously, in terms of logistics and economics, it's far better to do a large section if you're going to do surface dressing or resurfacing or any of those other treatments than it is to just pick out the red bits. Of course, what that means is you've just turned then all of that section into as new, or set the clock again for that. So that's quite different from a model that might just pick out the very poor and reset that, assuming that you're going to maintain it. So that's just worth bearing in mind. So what we do when we're doing our life cycle model is ask you what kind of treatments do you use, because they are the ones that are being used now. They will have an impact into the future. But we can also ask you, would you like to model other types of treatments if you introduced a bit more of this, preventative maintenance at a later stage or an earlier stage? What impact would that have? I talked about uncertainty being a really important part of modelling, and the idea of the model is to reduce that. So, big one, budgets, inflation. Again, to make the assumption that your budget will go up in line with inflation. Anybody here had a budget go up in line with inflation? Yeah, exactly. And even if it did, it might well be CPI, or, it won't be the construction index. So we do actually, we do get our figures again from the British Construction Index. They do some forecasting on inflation. So when we're looking at our models, certainly for the next 2 years, we can build some quite good surety. I say that. Well, it's not really worked out recently, has it, inflation, and anybody guessing on it? Who'd have thought? But anyway, there we go. But we build in as much, again, certainty as we can. And we build in as much certainty on council budgets as we can. And one of the things we do look at is, for example, capital funding tends to stay the same for about 3 to 5 years. And then it has a bit of the jump for inflation. So a lot of the stuff that comes from the DFT doesn't have an inflationary increase every year, whereas a lot of your revenue funding might, or 1% a bit, or whatever it is. So we do try and balance that out in our model as well, so that we're looking at what money do you actually have against what is your inflationary increase likely to be. I talked about outcomes. So the headline scenarios, the kind of things where you would test the big stuff. You know, what happens if I have less money? What happens if I have more? What happens if I do this? What happens if I want to keep everything just as it is? I don't want it to get worse, but now I can't get it any better. And what I did say is there may be no one best solution, because a lot of it depends on some limitations. The obvious one might be budget, but some of the other ones might be political will, or what your council priorities are. You know, so you might, again, have to look at those trade-offs in terms of the perfect scenario. You might even have issues about you're going to have a huge amount of, new gifts works going through. In which case, do you really want to be doing any works in year 1 and 2? Or do you want to put those off? So, again, the perfect scenario where you've got these nice smooth layers of works doesn't always fit your particular circumstances. But what we're looking at, again, don't forget, is the longer term. So we're looking at strategic decisions. We're looking at what happens to your A roads, your B roads, what happens to your overall capital expenditure, what happens to that with or without inflation, and what are the quantities of treatments that you might be doing. For example, in this particular scenario, you can see we show you quantities of work as well as the budget. Those are the kind of outcomes that you would be expecting from a life cycle model. To give you that intelligence so that you can look at, well, what are we getting? What will we do if we do this? What would be the capital cost, for example? Now, don't forget that's for different scenarios. So we're not necessarily saying do this. We're saying under this scenario, if you only have X budget, these are the outputs that you need to look at. This is what will happen, for example. I guess most people have seen these kind of charts. This is fairly obvious. This is a 5-grade system, so the blue is good, very good, and the red is very poor. And it's a fairly obvious chart. If you've got more money, it starts to look quite rosy in the blue. If you've got less money, it starts to look quite blue in the red. So that was a really bad joke, actually. I don't know if even anyone got that, but never mind. That's fairly straightforward, of course, but there's other more subtle things. So what happens if I do more preventative maintenance? Or what happens if I could ask the council for another 500,000? You know, might not be much, but actually it could make a difference to your early years, for example. So there's more information behind just, it's obvious, if you've got more money, your roads are probably in better condition. If you've got less money, they're probably in worse condition. There's lots more to think about. One of the things we also do is look at carbon. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, highways maintenance is still quite heavily carbonised. There's lots of stuff on the way that's reducing that. And there will be lots of stuff in the future that reduce that. But nonetheless, the honest truth is, if you want to improve your roads, you are going to be expending some carbon. However, what we do is also take traffic emissions. So again, from proper statistics, DFT, transport planning, etc. What happens if your road is a lot smoother, if it's a better ride? Well, obviously traffic emissions go down, and that's the same for electric vehicles as well. They may not be doing tailpipe emissions, but their consumption of fuel becomes much better as well. So we can offset at least some of the CO2 emissions by looking at traffic emissions as well. But also we'll do that for every scenario. So you can see under there, we've given you lots of different scenarios about what might be better in the longer term for carbon outputs compared to other sorts of treatment. And I said before as well, you might be quite limited in what you can do. So the other thing that we think is really, really important in our life cycle model is with what you have. So breaking it down, not just by these headline scenarios, but what happens if you change your maintenance regime slightly. So I mentioned before, what happens if you kind of let the roads go a little bit further before you do preventative, for example, maybe a bit more patching. What happens if you do, I'll start introducing micro asphalt if you haven't done that before in certain locations. What happens if you only do resurfacing? Probably you won't keep up is the answer. I might not need to do 25-year models to tell you that. But, but these are the things that we have to actually scientifically test. It has to be tested through data if you're going to speak with confidence to members and say, well, actually, council, I'm afraid that idea won't work because, or actually, do you know what, we are doing our best and I appreciate you can't give me any more extra money, but, and it can be quite interesting how sometimes extra money can be found. Like councils might go away and start thinking, I know it doesn't sound likely, but I once did a sort of gully life cycle and showed that we were doing really high-risk cleansing. Funnily enough, I got quite a lot of capital expenditure to clean out all our soakaways. Small thing, but boy, did they need doing. You won't believe the tons that come out, one of them. Well, I forgot to say, I used to work for a local highway authority before Gaist. Okay, I'm nearly done. These are the key points I wanted to make. It's about evidence-based information. It's about giving you what you need to make decisions. It's about working with you to make sure that you get the information that you want. I said before that it's about using as much knowledge as possible, and that will always change. So actually, you could expect your models to change a bit over time. You could expect some of that information that you might have done 5 years ago to be not quite the same as you're doing now. That's okay. You always want to make sure that you're verifying it and that we're looking backwards as well as forwards. But things can always improve. Highways, really tricky things. There are some time-based stuff you can do. Even now, I'm not quite sure with lights changing luminaires, etc., whether that's time-based anymore or whether, again, you're still testing. But with things like carriageways and footways, they're actually quite complex organisms, really. And so it's not easy just to say, well, every 5 years you do this. And even if once upon a time you could say that, most people don't have the funding anymore to do a time-based maintenance. So there'll always be uncertainty as well in the long term. So some people ask about individual street deterioration. You could do that, but you do have to know that actually if you're looking 60 years for one particular street, you really can't tell. You could just have one poor reinstatement go through it, and that life cycle model that you've done for that one individual street just will be meaningless. So just be a bit careful. We tend to do it at a strategic level because you actually reduce some of the uncertainty then. You're saying your A roads will, on the whole, on the balance of probability, perform like this. But Coronation Street, Queen Street, And then, as I say, there isn't necessarily a universal truth. I wish there was. Because then, obviously, we could make loads of money, a bit like knowing what inflation's going to do. But it's really about doing what you can with what you've got and with what people expect of you, but also being able to tell others why you're doing what you're doing. So you can't necessarily say, this is the one best outcome, but you can certainly say, I've really looked into this. I've really taken a data-led approach. I've really thought about how I want to manage my highways. I've really thought about the budget. Thanks for nothing, but I'm going to do this with it. So that is about it. These are asset management standards, and obviously as well the original. Anyone remember HMEP?
Yeah.
So it's still hosted on the UK Roads Leadership Board, and a lot of these hold very true. Obviously, the Code of Practice, I think, really good. I have read it all. It's actually quite readable. But yeah, so well worth looking at, and obviously the asset management side of things, which is about greater than highways. If anyone wants to have a look at those, I'm sure most of you actually already know them. If you would like to know any more about life cycle modelling, I have done some CPD sessions that are longer, and also very happy to come and talk to any authorities or people or anything really. I think I've done quite well because it's been a long day. I haven't tripped over. I haven't got it on timer. I might have talked longer than I should, but you know what? Let the party begin. Thank you very much.